You're watching the Daily Climate Show on Sky News. Coming up on today's programme, the UN says countries' current plans to cut emissions won't stop global warming and predicts temperatures will rise by at least 2.7 degrees this century. A row erupts between MPs and peers over measures to stop water companies pumping raw sewage into waterways. And confused over climate change, a new poll finds the public distrusting of politicians and put off by conflicting information. Hello and welcome to the UK's only daily climate news show where we track the changes happening to our world right now and challenge those coming up with the solutions. The UN has issued a stark warning that world leaders aren't doing enough to cut carbon emissions to combat global warming ahead of the Global Climate Summit in Glasgow next week. Its annual emissions gap report says current commitments by countries to reduce emissions fall far short of what is needed to keep the world's temperature to an increase of no more than 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. The report finds that new and updated national climate action plans only reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 7.5% in 2030. A 55% reduction is needed to meet the 1.5 degree target agreed in Paris in 2015. The current promises which have been made put the world on track for a temperature rise of at least 2.7 degrees this century, while net zero commitments could reduce this increase to 2.2 degrees. Our science and technology editor, Tom Clark, has more.
The UN Secretary-General calling this a thundering wake-up call. I mean, it's hard to think of how many more wake-up calls the world really needs when it comes to climate change. But looking at the shortfall in emissions cuts that this report lays starkly bare, there's really hardly any other phrase you can think of to describe it. We do have an enormous challenge ahead of us, and every country in the world has got to work a lot harder. Even here in the UK, we've put forward one of the leading net zero pledges to do that by 2050, and we put a plan in place for how to do it. But it's important, let's not forget, that we're still heavily reliant on fossil fuels here in the UK. This gas-fired power station is still essential for keeping our lights on at times when the wind isn't blowing or there isn't very much nuclear power on the grid. Our net zero strategy is going to be fraught with challenges. But for some countries, there isn't really very much of a plan at all, and that's what the UN is trying to sort of really put out there ahead of the Glasgow summit. World leaders, you need to show more ambition. We need to go further. But it's important to point out also the UNEP report is erring on the pessimistic side. It's only looking about what national governments have put forward. There's a lot of diplomacy and jostling that goes on ahead of a climate summit. What's actually going on in the real economy, you could argue, is a slightly rosier picture. Take Australia, for example. Its 6 states together have put forward a more ambitious plan for cutting carbon than the Australian national government have managed to do. That's repeated in other places around the world. Lots of businesses going for net zero targets that aren't included in this UNEP report. And also the real economy is now switching away from fossil fuels to renewable energy. The costs of those are coming down. We're switching to electric cars and other forms of heating our homes and cooling that are more sustainable. Again, not featured in that report. It's a stark and very worrying, concerning warning ahead of the climate summit in Glasgow, but it's certainly on the more pessimistic side of what we can expect to see.
The government has defended itself against claims it's not doing enough to stop sewage ending up in the country's waterways. MPs voted against an amendment to the Environment Bill, which would have put a legal duty on water companies to reduce raw sewage discharges into rivers, which happened more than 400,000 times last year, according to the Environment Agency. But Downing Street said the current proposal is uncosted and a lot is already being done to tackle the issue. Sky's Helen Ann Smith has more.
There's a real sense of fury gathering ahead of steam over this issue, particularly in places like this. I'm in Saltdean on the south coast, one of the places that over the last few weeks has had sewage released into the ocean there. It's just a few miles up from Seaford, which is one of the 8 places along the south coast where Southern Water have said that they've actually had a wastewater release in the last 24 hours. And locals who swim here, who kite surf here, say that they often notice a lot of the really filthy stuff that gets released into the water. A swimmer said sometimes you'll see sanitary products floating around, things like that. So a real sense of anger here locally. It's worth noting on this issue that there's actually nothing new about releasing wastewater into the seas. It happens because of the old vestiges of our old Victorian sewage system, where rainwater and wastewater aren't dealt with separately. So when there's a lot of wet weather or too much water in the system, they both have to be released together. But the reason this is such a matter of attention right now is because there was a chance, according to campaigners, for things to improve. There was an amendment tabled to the Environment Bill which would make it much, much more difficult for water companies to do this, and that amendment was rejected, and that's caused this huge outpouring of rage on social media. Lots of constituents tagging their local MP if their local MP voted against this issue. So pressure really mounting on the government, and it's mounting in particular because COP starts next week. This is the moment where they're really trying to burnish their green credentials. Worth saying that those MPs and Southern Water and other water companies say the reason this is so complicated for them is because it would cost hundreds of billions to update that sewage system. A very, very expensive thing to do. Some really start wanting to have a conversation about how that's funded, but at this time of the rising cost of living, it just hasn't really played out to be a priority. But certainly for people here, absolutely furious, and they say it should be a human right for people to swim in clean seas here.
A lack of trust in politicians and the media, along with too many conflicting opinions, are leaving the public confused about climate change. While most people are concerned about the issue and willing to make changes, many don't know who or what to believe. Our climate change correspondent, Hannah Thomas-Peter, is here with me. Hannah, the information's coming thick and fast, so are the warnings, but are they getting through?
Well, that could be a real problem, according to this poll, which was conducted by YouGov and the University of Cambridge in collaboration with the Conversation website and shared exclusively with Sky News. It found that 67% of people don't trust politicians to tell them the truth about climate change. 54% don't trust journalists, and 71% don't trust online influencers. There are high levels of trust in academics, though, with 67% of consumers trusting them to be truthful. This was closely followed, by the way, with high levels of trust in friends and family, too. The poll also revealed that people are finding climate change information difficult to understand. Over a quarter found climate change content on social media confusing. Nearly 2/3 say there are too many conflicting opinions. And over a third of consumers found general media coverage problematic too, with 39% declaring it too abstract and too focused on the future rather than the here and now. This is what Sander van der Linden, Professor of Social Psychology from Cambridge University, had to say about the potential impact of all of this.
When people lose trust in mainstream media sources, this can erode, informed public discourse. People can turn to alternative sources for information about climate change, which may not always be helpful, and it can generally just leads to a skewed information diet. I think we generally, have a bit of a trust problem, and I think the way to fix that is to, get better at communicating facts about climate change and making sure that misinformation doesn't spread.
Well, why does all of this matter so much right now? Well, we are just days away from that crucial UN climate summit that's going to be held in Glasgow, COP26, and trust is the currency at the very heart of that summit. Politicians need the public to trust in them and believe in the solutions that they're going to be agreeing on.
Hannah, thank you. In some of today's other climate news, 2 climate activists shut down Queensland's largest coal port after locking themselves to a coal conveyor belt. The Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, has announced Australia will reach net zero by 2050. But one activist, Juliette Lamont, says the country's plans are lagging behind in a shameful way.
This is a Prime Minister whose country is burning in the last bushfire season, and he's holidaying in Hawaii with a beer while his country burns and says that he can't even hold a hose. So, we have absolutely no leadership, and it's shameful. I don't know if it's too much to say that we need carbon tariffs and trade sanctions, but he really needs to get a sort of a realistic and a climate policy that he can implement now, because we're lagging behind in a shameful way.
And a green finance summit in Paris has been disrupted by activists. Members of the protest group Les Amis de la Terre accuse the French president of failing to tackle investment in fossil fuels. Macron's government says it is committed to going carbon neutral by 2050, but a court found France failed to respect its own carbon budget earlier this month. China will take action to reduce waste, promote renewables and reform its electricity network as part of its plan to bring carbon emissions to a peak before 2030. The new action plan repeats China's targets to build more hydropower and nuclear plants and develop natural gas resources. Our correspondent Tom Cheshire has more.
A lot of people had been hoping for something big and new from China ahead of COP26. This isn't that. What this is the detail of how they're going to meet their existing emissions plan that President Xi Jinping announced last year to be carbon neutral by 2060, but specifically for this one, to peak emissions by 2030. And it is a bit of a mixed bag even then. On one hand, you have got what looks like a pretty comprehensive document. A lot of work has gone into that. This touches nearly every aspect of the Chinese economy. So it's perhaps being entrenched in the bureaucracy. And that means there's less of a chance of backsliding on these stated goals. But on the other hand, you've got some pretty conservative language when it comes to peaking emissions. They talk about doing it rationally and maintaining energy security as well. And then when it comes to coal, things are a bit more worrying too. Coal is, of course, the most polluting fossil fuel, and China burns more of it than the rest of the world combined. It said it will peak emissions by 2025, but it says it will rationally control the growth until then. So there is still going to be growth, and then only gradually reduce it afterwards. So in terms of how long that peak would be for the Chinese use of coal, people hoping it would drop off quickly. It doesn't seem like that's going to be the case. It's going to have a long tail, and that is obviously bad news for the environment.
Do stay with us. Coming up after the break, we'll be discussing that warning from the UN that we're in danger of seeing a global temperature increase of 2.7% this century. I'll be joined by the economist Vicky Pryce and Professor of Global Change Science at UCL and the University of Leeds, Simon Lewis.
Did you know if more of us walked, rode bikes and scooted to school, we would make a big difference to the air pollution around our school? Yeah, like us.
Wednesday will start mild, windy and dry for many, but Ireland, Northern Ireland, Southern Scotland and Cumbria will see rain, heavy on the hills. There'll be little change through the morning, but western parts of Ireland should dry up. The best of the sunshine will be across northern Scotland. It'll stay very mild and windy. During the afternoon, the rain will largely clear into northwest England and northwest Wales. The unsettled conditions mean air pollution levels are expected to remain low, with the levels between 1 and 3 on the Daily Air Quality Index.
The Air Quality Report, sponsored by Philips Air Purifiers.
Hello and welcome back to the Daily Climate Show on Sky News, and we're getting straight to discussing the climate issues of the day with the economist Vicky Pryce and Professor of Global Change Science at UCL and the University of Leeds, Simon Lewis. Current climate change pledges from world leaders will not be enough to keep global temperature targets, according to a new report from the United Nations. The organisation's Secretary-General has warned world leaders that the era of promises must end, saying closing the emissions gap must start in Glasgow. As world leaders come under even more pressure just a few days before COP26, can the summit be a success? Vicky, it has been described as a thundering wake-up call today that the world is heading towards climate catastrophe. Will world leaders pay attention ahead of that summit?
Well, they will, and I think we've been prepared for it. I mean, obviously, there was some hints that the report was going to suggest pretty bad news in terms of what has been achieved so far and what the various pledges will be achieving. And of course, it's a wake-up call. And Boris Johnson himself has been telling everyone not to expect perhaps too much, because that gap is enormous in the sense of what needs to be done extra if we are to get even near achieving the 1.5. It looks like on current projections, if we believe the figures that are coming out now, that we're going to be way above that. And what needs to happen is that efforts should be concentrated very much on what goes on between now and 2030. And what I find quite surprising, actually, is that despite the fact that both the UK, of course, and the EU seem to have quite ambitious plans that they have put together, which will be reducing carbon emissions very significantly from 1990 levels, with the EU, of course, pledging 55%, the UK pledging even higher figures by 2030 to 2035. Obviously, the big emitters, the US, China, and of course, up to a point, also India, don't look like they're doing enough. I'm guessing that is why it looks so bad in terms of what the pledges are telling us.
Simon, the warning came that if there's no meaningful change, we will have lost forever the chance of achieving 1.5 Celsius and a warning of 2.7 degree rises in temperatures this century. In practical terms, what would that mean? What would it look like?
It's a world we really don't want to find out about. Large areas of the Earth would have unlivable heat at parts of the year. We would see the kind of climate impacts we saw last summer of massive heat waves in Canada, of floods washing houses into the rivers in Germany and people up to their necks in water on the subway system in China happening with great frequency. And for me, I think it's very hard to see how agriculture globally can adapt to that kind of level of change and keep food supplies going for what will at that point be 8 or 9 billion people on Earth. It would be a real catastrophe. And world leaders in these next 2 weeks really need to push hard to have practical policies to reduce emissions in the short term.
And Simon, we heard that warning from the Prime Minister yesterday that he's really worried. We've had Saudi Arabia's pledges, we've had Australia today, but the problem has been highlighted that many of those net zero goals remain vague. We haven't got the details of them, and much of the heavy lifting is pushed to after 2030. Is anything in Glasgow going to change that?
Well, I do think that these net zero pledges are important because they bring climate action 2 decades earlier, and that means that we then start talking about what is going to happen in the 2020s. And what to watch out for at this summit is the first 2 days when more than 120 world leaders will be in Glasgow making pledges and making announcements. And that's the time to look for potentially big announcements about what might happen over the next decade.
Vicky and Simon, stay with us because another report released today has shed new light on our online data habits, in particular storing photos. It's claimed that unwanted digital photos produce the same amount of carbon emissions as more than 100,000 return flights from London to Australia. So, do we all need to take more responsibility for tackling the climate crisis? Vicky, we think about what we do at home, don't we? We think about the way in which we use energy. We think about the cars that we drive. We think about the things that we eat, for example. I've never even considered my phone and the photographs that I take as being a factor here.
Well, absolutely. I have to say, when I read the report, I immediately looked at all my photographs. Well, I didn't look at them all because, of course, there are so many. I, like everyone else, is keeping rather a lot of data on our phones and computers that perhaps we don't need to do. But the knowledge that platforms like, whether it's Facebook, Google, for example, are in fact making us all, and they themselves consume an awful lot of energy, has been around for some time. And the figures are such that suggest that, in fact, the energy consumed through all our uses, if you like, is something equivalent to airline emissions, global airline emissions at present, which is pretty large. That's about 3 to 4% of global emissions. And of course, there is a huge increase in the use. And although we've read about this, of course, we individually didn't think that just Googling something a few times also, of course, emits at the end of the day, a lot of CO2. What I worry about is that this report says what we as individuals should do. But obviously, policymakers should know that this is happening. The data has been out there for some time, and we know that it's going to be even bigger in the future. I mean, the question now with post-COVID and us all using a lot of social media and other ways in terms of communicating. That is supposed to be good for the environment. I think something needs to give. So we can't just be living in this ignorance, or at least most people, not realizing that what they're doing is also contributing to worsening the environment. And I don't know, and I haven't quite thought about what the implications of this can be, whether indeed all those platforms can be more energy efficient, but obviously they need to.
OK, and Simon, I did the same as Vicky. I looked immediately when I read this at the number of photos on my phone. I don't even want to admit it. Vicky talked about the responsibility of individuals. Is there something we can all do to clean up our habits? And what about the companies themselves?
Well, I looked at this report as a conscientious scientist and looked at the calculations behind it. And what they're saying is that all of this social media and internet activity is about 0.2% of our emissions over the whole year. So it's very, very small. And we need to keep in mind the big picture here. If we get our electricity system down to zero emissions through renewables, then we can then take as many photographs as we like.
Vicky, Simon, thanks to both of you. Well, that is everything from us for today. Joining us on tomorrow's show is Greenpeace UK's Head of Climate, Kate Blagojevich, and organic farmer and Deputy President of the National Farmers Union, Stuart Roberts. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.